What are you waiting for? Do it.
You might be asking yourself, Jerry, why? It's simple. If RWBY Alt, Cherish, the fan base, and hours of watching riot footage from Europe have taught me anything, it's that democracy has failed. I'm going all in. If you're new here, which you're not, let me give a brief rundown what this is. RWBY is a piece of shit. Not the first 3 seasons, not the last 3 seasons. All of it. From beginning to end. No exceptions. It's all terrible. Holy shit. There are a few novel ideas hidden away in there, but it's not enough to save it. It's a total dumpster fire. And personally, I'm getting more gasoline. Hope you all brought snacks. What is the measure of a soul? Can it be weighed or rounded? Are they dense? Are they metaphysical or physical or gaseous? How are they born? Are they equal or are some greater than others? Where does the mind and the soul begin? What is the worth of the human spirit and how can we explain it? These are the tribulations of a disenchanted age where the mind and the machine are one, where the path to salvation isn't found through scripture or altruism, but through a greater understanding of the physicalis. The mind is the brain. The eyes are lenses, the tongue is a muscle, the hand has 27 bones, the body has 650 muscles. The universe is a myriad of atoms, the atom is a myriad of quarks, light obeys gravity, gravity is the measure of movement, and movement is the song of the assembly line. No gods, no kings, no crowns or thrones. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. RWBY Alt is a story about fantasy and science fiction duking it out in the mortal world to see who will be the guiding hand of humankind. Spoiler alert, the old way of thinking, belief systems, fables, folktales, nationalism, imperialism, and religious doctrine is being rushed aside in the later stages of this world's industrial revolution. Generation by generation, the masses surrender to the assembly line in hopes of climbing the social ladder. Don't worry, they won't. But there was one thing economic determinism didn't count on: fantasy's secret weapon, an ultimate irredeemable evil that can't be studied and, even worse, can't be colonized. The Grimm, a race of intangible shadow demons that can take any form and fuck your shit up. They started showing up around the time that the old empire fell, although their relation isn't quite known. Most religions theorize they came from the dark side of the moon, and when the moon shattered in an event known as the Fall, they came crashing down to Terria alongside a vast quantity of lunar dust, which we'll get into later. The Fall is a totally unknown and completely nebulous event that has been the center of scholarly debate for the past millennium. All we know is that the moon shattered, the Grimm showed up, and the empire fell apart, ushering in an age of total anarchy, with the major exception of a province known as Atlas. Atlas was the original capital province of the Empire of Marathon, and when the world unraveled, they relocated all of their armies and aristocracy to the capital in hopes of preserving order and their fucking lives. Thankfully, enough of the province emerged unscathed for them to re-establish order. But not so luckily, the moment they stepped out of their bunkers, they came face to face with an army of Grimm spreading rapidly across the surface of Terria. Only so much of their military could be used to fend off these creatures, keep the peace, and reclaim their lost territories. Needless to say, it was a shit show. Eventually, some absolute mad lad came up with the brilliant idea of a eugenics program where warriors could be bred and trained to ward off these aliens and function as military police. Surprising literally no one, the program was not very popular. What the hell? So naturally, Atlas began abducting peasants to fill their quotas. At least, that's what the Northerners want you to think. They were just peacefully persuaded into becoming emotionless killing machines, you fucking Taurian scum. After rooting out the weak and building their hunters into a force to be reckoned with, eliminating any doubt to the validity and strength of the Empire and brainwashing them into total service to the state, Atlas began taking back their province. 500 years later, and the Grimm are finally pushed back beyond the Boreal Mountains. Atlas didn't have the resources forces up until that point to simultaneously flush out the Grimm and reincorporate its northern territories. But now that the Grimm were far away from the plains of Marathon, it was finally time to shift focus. Unfortunately for them, there were people in these territories now, and they preferred to be left alone. Not to mention members of the unstoppable warrior class splintering off and forming their own tribes outside the province. This, coupled with the fading memory of the Empire's majesty and legacy, spelled the end of the imperial province. Although monarchs henceforth would still be known as Imperator, the capital province of Atlas was shortly reorganized into a feudal monarchy, and so begins the second period. I promise you, all of this is extremely important. One thing I didn't touch on was that throughout all of this, the Atlant people had also discovered how to reverse engineer imperial tech by mining deposits of lunar dust that crashed onto Terria in the fall. Much like Portal, Portal 2, and probably not happening. Lunar dust, or dust in shorthand, is a useful and durable source of power. When crushed to extreme or sudden levels of stress, it combusts. And for the first half millennium of its time on Terria, humanity used it to light their cities, warm their homes, and burn down government buildings in peaceful protest. But sometime after the beginning of the second period, someone figured out that when connected to a conductive wire, dust could also produce a brief current of electricity, a resource that had since been lost after the fall of the Empire of Marathon. It wasn't nearly as productive as electric generators would be in the third period, and they didn't quite understand how it worked, but hey, it got the job done. More or less, dust and the insane amounts of demonic Grimm attempting to fuck your shit at the Boro Mountains kept the wrath of industry and progress in check. And although the history of Marathon past the first period gets complicated, the general gist is that Atlas hates everyone, everyone hates Atlas, dust is a weak, albeit extremely valuable power source, and the threat of Grimm just beyond the mountains maintains a region-wide warrior caste of disciplined warriors known as the Hunters, who are split into two factions. The Sentinels, who function as military police and sellswords, and Venators, who operate outside Marathon and generation by generation push back the demonic menace. There's also an ancient-ass dam that Atlas uses to control the free banks downstream, and the free banks can't do anything about it. But the Hovel Dam, in and of itself, is a story for probably not another time. Where are we? 100 years ago, miners in the Northern Federation of Celebrir figured out a more efficient means of generating power, the combustion engine, and with the advent of trains came Marathon's industrial revolution. Also, Atlas is in a tough spot financially speaking. They absolutely botched an invasion of the nearby principalities and sent their economy down the shitter. For the first time in forever, Atlas is vulnerable, not to mention the unification of the northern Boro principalities by the military state of Torinth. Tensions are high, alliances are being formed, a very subversive man is spreading wild ideas in Atlas, and the world moves faster and faster towards total war.
Last man standing.
I'm going there.
Enter the renowned Venator, Summer Rose, who tragically dies in the line of duty and leaves her daughters Ruby and Yang in the hands of her teammate and husband, Tai Yang Xiaolong. For future reference, Tai Yang is a complete loser.
And anyone who says otherwise is wrong.
And even though Yang has a hard time living without a mother, Ruby wants nothing more than to be hers. The greatest hunter in the world? How about the greatest hunter who ever fucking lived? She's young, she's naive, everyone has high hopes for her, and over the course of RWBY Alternate, her precious worldview will slowly but surely succumb. Because in a sense, RWBY is fighting to uphold the fabled and altruistic legacy of her mother and the Hunters. But in a world where the soul is nothing more than another object to be studied, she will learn that not everything is sunshine and rainbows, and that sometimes good can only prevail through evil. That's the basic outline of RWBY Alternate. It's meant to introduce the main character, establish a history, and most importantly, set a tone. This story is about the diminishing of fantasy, and the ultimate compromise that Ruby Rose must find in her quest to become the greatest hunter of them all. Everything else, relatively speaking, is either totally irrelevant or subservient to that struggle. But let's continue. For tonal reasons, the fall is completely unknown. There is no in-universe explanation for it, and I'm not spoiling shit, so don't even fucking try. All you need to know is the fall is the direct result of the old Empire's fading sense of humanity. Before the fall, the Empire of Marathon worshipped two gods, Amos and Ani, the two governing wills of the sky, just as men and women were the two governing souls of Teria. The mourning of Ani's death during the fall devolved into her becoming a monotheistic entity, and although people still mentioned Amos by name, Anicism in its later denominations was essentially a culture of mourning and guilt around Ani's death. Church processions were more akin to funerals and wakes than they were masses, and disrespecting her memory by killing her children of the night, the Grimm, was like robbing the grave of Christ, because initially the Grimm were thought of as the good guys. And the fall, in all its traumatic memory, was humankind's punishment for disrespecting and murdering Ani. That was the prominent culture of the second period. Although Atlas and the surrounding tribes were willing to defend themselves against the Grimm and push them back beyond the Bora Mountains in the first period, nobody bothered pushing them further. Why? Well, worshipping Grimm is all fine and dandy, but you know what's dandier? Food. More or less trade routes between large cities. People essentially had to choose between disrespecting some dead god and not starving, and for a while they were fine with the former, but eventually, like good plebeians, they accepted their fate as subhumans and propagated the Anicist religion to an extreme degree. Humankind was barred to venture beyond Marathon. It was their mortal prison, and for killing Ani, they would live there for all eternity. What kicks off the third period is some asshole figuring out that this whole thing is bullshit and blaming the Grimm for Ani's death, and people fucking believed him, because when you think about it, a shadow demon with zero redeeming qualities probably isn't holy. And although the hunters had basically vanished at this point, their descendants totally integrated into medieval society, their legacy was not forgotten. Ordinary adventurers took up arms against the demons in the west and began pushing them farther and farther away, generation by generation. Now suddenly, the metaphysical qualities of Venators and Sentinels, what scholars dub the Aura, is God's gift to humankind, to fight back the darkness in her stead and vanquish her enemies through her benevolent grace. Aura is just the general sturdiness that hunters have in combat. There's nothing particularly special about it. Everyone has it. It just varies depending on the experience. Naturally, the first hunter groups were organized into monasteries and religious orders, as the nature of hunting Grimm was in and of itself a matter of religion. Over time, Venators beyond the mountains began unearthing valuable riches and relics from the imperial period, prompting many governments and wealthy individuals to abandon Anicism for its modernized anti-Grimm reformation, Avanism. Today, hunters are starting to get antiquated. The advent of firearms did little to subdue the resurgent warrior caste, but what did deal a crushing blow was the advent of industry. Why bother unearthing valuable goods beyond the mountains when you can just manufacture them in Marathon? Not to mention the upheaval of the warrior caste by the rise of the middle class, and the emergence of standing armies with weaponry and funding that hunters could never dream of. Amid the chaotic revolutions that industry brings comes a spiritual awakening in a sense across Marathon. People are disillusioned and have lost their simple way of life to function in a network, and religious leaders started to take advantage of this. Much like our world's Great Awakenings, people celebrated their religious fervor by reinstating and reinforcing the place of religion in everyday life. Why is this important? Because before she died, Summer Rose started a hunter society called Beacon Academy, situated in a river valley in the Bora Mountains and built with the idealistic and egalitarian standards of her homeland Gailis. Everyone of every color, race, gender, sex, nationality, and religious denomination could attend and learn their hand at becoming a defender of humankind. But when she died and the founders, Team Stark, were now 2 members short of 4, a private investor stepped in to assume control of the institution and transform it into a monastery where only true believers were allowed. No furries, no gays, and absolutely no fucking heretics. You might be asking yourself, how is this bad? It's not. Moving on. That private investor was a one Jacques Schnee, patriarch of the Schnee fortune and the most diabolical family this side of the Seros. His daughter, Wai Schnee, isn't a hunter, but she spends so much time at the Church of Beacon, she will ultimately decide to become one. That's enough history though. Let's talk story. I know, scary. We know what this story is about on a thematic level. Fantasy versus science fiction set at a junction where the world is rapidly evolving into an industrial network. A main character who fights for the sake of fantasy but doesn't quite understand the implications of either and refuses to accept the futility of fighting the future. Our endgame is a compromise of recognizing maximizing the efficiency and welfare of an industrial state, but also respecting the human element of fantasy. Just because the soul may exist doesn't necessarily mean we have to measure it, which is, ironically, a mindset the Discord couldn't accept. Good riddance. It wouldn't be an industrial revolution without a good old-fashioned global conflict as the climax. So the final act of this story will be situated on events relating to a world war and the downfall of Atlas. Everything leading up to it will also somewhat focus on the rise and influence of an extremist populist group in Atlas known as the Kurzheim, led by the apostate John Nikos.
You're fucked.
What do you mean we're fucked?
No, I do not.
And how its victory over the monarchists ultimately leads to the Great War of Marathon. It's only fitting for such a legendary nation to see its end with a bang. Eris Victor, brothers. The war is important because it's not just a turning point for Marathon's history, effectively ending the reign of Atlas, but also because it's an ideological turning point. Much like our own world wars, which kind of get squished into one here, people start treating industry with much more scrutiny than before. Throwback to our own industrial revolution, where people began asking why the meat smelled so funny in 1906 and advocated for sanitary reform in the food processing industry. Random example, I know, but that general attitude of stepping back and realizing that maybe using poison gas on soldiers is unethical is what people will ultimately get out of this war. It may even bring about the end of the warrior caste as their effectiveness in battle begins dwindling with the advent of the war machine. It also just sort of makes sense to end an action series with a big war.
Get away from her!
I don't even know who you are.
The four lead characters, RWBY included, are in some way directly involved in this conflict, either out of moral obligation to stop the Kurzheim from taking over the world, or because someone or something they love is at stake. I don't know exactly what, but I can tell you now that RWBY takes offense to the cold and industrial ideologies of the Kurzheim, mostly because they're everything the New Church of Beacon stands for. Segregation, oppression, discrimination, racial determinism, perfectly reasonable ideas. She sees the world her mother fought for in jeopardy and wants to protect it at all cost. Does she win? I don't know. The Great War isn't a good versus bad deal. It's a loss on all sides, because the war isn't just whether or not the faunus have the right to breathe. It's about how far we should go as humans before we turn into the very machines we build. But Jerry, why can't we just have an evil bad guy to punch at? Because that's racist. You don't want to be a racist,
do you?
The only real thematic takeaway from RWBY Former is to not be a bad person or else you'll get punched a little, and that's fucking stupid. RWBY Former says racism is bad and sometimes shows it. RWBY Alt is about why racism is bad. Race theory, ethics, you know, conversations, as opposed to just pointing in a direction and saying white woman bad. I'm not really concerned with having interesting action because that's easy and RWBY already has that in a sense. I'm more interested in why they're fighting than I am in what they're fighting. Ruby Rose doesn't want to fight people, but she ends up fighting them all the same. And people aren't irredeemable. They're not demons and they're not perfect. So why not go crazy? Something I forgot to include was a basic story outline of the events that transpire in the order in which they're supposed to get the fuck away from me.
It's written in the stars.
What the hell?
Continued in part 2.